Here's the reference photo for the Surreal sheep painting that I'm going to create today for you. So the reference photo is actually a zoomed in portion of a photograph of a large flock of sheep up on Dartmoor. And that's something I often do. If I've got a photograph of a large group of animals, I'll try to create maybe a dozen different paintings in different styles from the same reference. And part of the way I do that is by looking at different parts of the flock or herd of animals that I'm dealing with. Now you can see I'm using a giant brush here. This is a size 70 synthetic brush. It's a flat oval, and I've got a mix of colours on my brush. As you can see, I've got some ultramarine blue, I've got a little bit of cerulean blue, and then I've mixed in with that a pale brown, which is a mix of burnt umber, a little bit of cad yellow, and a bit of cadmium red. And in addition to that, I've got some tinting white in there. And what I'm doing is applying this mixture of paint on the brush, which I'm varying with each application in a wiggly motion from right to left, as you can see, and it creates the most glorious patterns, really random, lovely effects. I'm painting onto A2 Daler-Rowney mixed media paper. I've got the paper up pretty close to vertical, and I pretty much drenched it in water as well with the spray bottle, so that's why you can see that bunched up kitchen roll at the bottom of the frame, because the water was running off it, so much that was pooling in the little shelf on my easel, so I just didn't want that dripping on the floor. The sketches of these three sheep that I've chosen to depict was created with a unipin marker, a grey unipin marker, so just a very loose, light treatment, little more than the outline included. And I've got a little bit of a history painting these kind of surreal farm animals against dramatically coloured skies. It's not the only style that I paint in, but it is a style that I return to once in a while, and it's something I very much enjoy. So towards the end of the video, I'll show you some of the other examples of that type of work, and let me know which one you think's your favourite, or whether you think this one is the best, or maybe the previous ones were better. But each one's a real fun experimental approach to painting, because it allows me to try out different ideas and different textures in the sky. As you can see, that's what I'm continuing to do now. And this is the first time I've used this huge brush in this way, by the way, so the other paintings were created in a slightly different way. I'm using my interactive acrylics, one of my go-to paints to use. And so going back, what I love about this technique is, as I say, it allows me to create interesting textures and experiment with painting skies. It's a fairly quick process. I can create a painting in a relatively speedy time. Not that that's a big concern for me, but it's just something to keep in mind if you'd like to try the technique yourself. And when I come to paint the animals, I really have fun with different colours and textures and things. So you can see I'm coming in with a purple here. So this is a mix of the cerulean blue and the cad red. Flat, small brush, and at the moment I'm not quite as happy with the way the paint is flowing or not flowing as I was with the sky. The paper's dried out a little bit. But really what I'm doing is just banging in some texture here to try and simulate the fluffiness of the texture of the fleece of that sheep on the right. So just added a little bit of water with the water spray bottle. And that allows the paint to move around much more readily around the painting, and you get the most wonderful different textures and effects using the interactive acrylic in this way. So I'm kind of following the contours a little bit there of the animal. You can't really see the rear legs of the animal in the little reference I've got on the bottom right of screen, but I'm more or less following the contours of the hindquarters there, the line of the back, but I'm not being overly fussy at this stage. This is very much a surreal, expressive interpretation of the sheep, so I'm definitely not looking to make them look realistic. The vast majority of my work is not super realistic, but I do have plenty of paintings which are far more lifelike and realistic in nature than the one I'm going to be creating here. So the idea really is to have fun with this technique, use fairly big brushes, bang in some color and texture, get the whole paper covered with paint pretty quickly. And then I find that if I do that without thinking about it too much and just kind of lay in all these colors, see what textural effects I get. And then when I've done that, when I've covered the paper, then I can kind of look at it with fresh eyes and think, okay, well, what do I need to do to kind of complete this painting? Or how little in terms of line work or detail do I need to add to just make this look like I've got 3 sheep? So you can see I'm not worrying about changes of colour in between the fleece and the head, or the fleece and the legs at the moment, or indeed changes of tone. And at the moment on camera it's looking like this right hand sheep is very distorted in shape, but that's partly due to the angle I've got the camera, and it's also partly due to the fact that the proportions are a little bit out, but we're going to deal with that towards the end of the video. Now, one of the dangers in working in this way is that while I'm never precious about my preliminary drawing, because I come in here, quick and fast with little regard for what's going on almost, there is a slight danger in just losing the drawing so much, or just being distracted by the amount of fun I'm having, that you just lose all sense of proportion with the animal you're trying to depict. So now moving on to the second sheep, I've got purple on the first one, so I'm going a little more yellowy now for the middle sheep, because obviously purple and yellow are complementary. Now it's not a pure yellow, as you've no doubt noticed already. It's cad yellow light mixed in with a little bit of magenta. Actually, I forgot to mention I had magenta on my palette before. So again, we're trying to keep the paint fairly fluid and flowing, not running down the paper like I did for part of the background, but enough fluidity that I can get some brush marks showing up in the paint that I'm putting down there. Taking the same approach as I did for the first animal, just blocking in the head with the same colour. So I'm sort of creating silhouettes with texture within them, basically. And for the third animal, a little bit more of a change in colour, going a little more greenish here. Still some sort of yellow ochre browns in the mix. And one of the things I was drawn to about this particular part of the flock is the back of the neck of the sheep on the left. The wind is blowing against the fur and it's kind of splaying out in a rosette. So I just tried to mimic that a little bit on the back of the neck. But again, I'm not overly concerned about following this photograph. Just need enough from the reference to kind of create a fairly realistic world, in the sense that within the completely surreal and imagined world that I'm creating, it kind of hangs together as a whole. If you make it kind of too wild, then I think it just becomes distracting from the actual thing you're trying to depict. But I'm carrying on with some of that lighter colour that I used on the face of the sheep on the left. For the middle sheep, I put a few marks there, and the same for the sheep on the right. So pure tinting white now, putting it down rather more thickly, trying to capture that wool kind of blowing in the wind. So really, it's this is one of the sort of scariest parts of this technique for me. This stage in the painting is always kind of a little bit concerning, in the sense that at this stage I sort of feel to myself, well, it's looking a bit, I don't know, not quite sure where this is going to end up. And, my hope is that, by the end I'm going to have created something which I am fairly happy with. But what I'm doing here with the thicker white paint is working wet in wet. So the underlying paint is still wet. And by putting the thick layer on top, depending on how hard I press with the brush, I can either put down a very thick impasto layer of white, so you can see the flicks of white on the middle sheet there, or as I did for the fleece of the left-hand sheet, by kind of dragging my paint, my brush loaded with white paint through the wet underlayer, it creates a softer kind of mixing translucent look. And it just adds a little bit of interest to the layers of paint, I feel. And it's quite a nice, efficient way to try and capture some wool-like texture. Now, if you're trying to do that technique that I just mentioned with conventional acrylic, you've got to be really, really quick, or you've got to use a retarding gel to slow down the drying. I'm using the interactive acrylics, so I put them down wet to begin with, and I was working fairly quickly, but let's say I'd had to walk away to mix some paint or wash out a brush or something, and I'd found the surface of the paint had dried. Well, one of the big advantages with these acrylics is if you spray the surface of the painting with water, that reactivates them, and you can use that technique that I just mentioned, the wet on wet, and it's a lot more relaxing. Basically, I always felt I still feel sometimes when I paint with conventional acrylic, I kind of work into a pretty tight deadline. But that said, I also try to adapt my approach, my technique to the medium I'm using. So, there are definitely advantages to traditional acrylics. Because they dry so quickly, that can be a real advantage. Just depends on what you're doing. Okay, so now we're adding some white to this big purple sheep here. And although I'm working pretty quickly, I am thinking quite carefully about the marks I'm making with my brush. So you'll notice I'm changing the direction of those marks. Sometimes I'm rolling the brush. Sometimes I'm going from top to bottom, or left to right, or vice versa. See, I've put in some kind of little arcs there, some straight lines, high pressure marks, just quick little flicks, and all of that. And of course, it depends how heavily loaded your brush is as well. All of that will affect the mark you get, and how wet the paint underneath will affect it as well. So, I'm getting little nice impasto edges on what is predominantly a translucent brush mark. So, there's a whole, I often think of a brush as being quite a simple thing, really, but it's really, very varied and multidimensional in terms of all the different marks you can make, especially when you bring in all the different dilutions of paint and different colors that you can put on your brush. So now I'm coming in with kind of a grayish shadow color. So it's burnt umber, a little bit of the cad red, it's probably a little bit of the yellow in there from memory, and some of the cerulean blue. And I'm just trying to pick out enough of what I've got going on with these sheep faces to, make it clear that there is actually a sheep there. It's not just a random blob of color. So I'm using this to pick out shadows in the face, shadows that are cast by the ears on the head, areas of dark shadow, typically at the bottom of the fleece, and in particular where the legs join the fleece. That's kind of often an area of interesting shaped shadows and deep shadows. If there are dark shadows on the legs, that's what I'm putting in now. So the body's kind of casting a shadow at the top of the legs, and I'm being particularly careful with the shapes of those shadows because I've got large areas here which are basically just random texture. So to kind of complement those areas and balance them out a bit, I need to put a few areas of kind of quite careful precision in terms of the mark making. But my hope is that I don't make those marks look too laboured. So I'm trying to be really efficient with the marks that I put down. And I'm trying to think to myself, okay, what's the least I can do? So this is an interesting little technique which I quite enjoy sometimes. I'm not sure how well it works in this particular case, but you can see at the base of the neck on that kind of orange sheet, there were little impasto flicks of white, which were put down really quite randomly. And then I used the shadow colour on my brush and just the tips of the bristles to put a little line of shadow along the edge of that impasto mark. Now, the impasto mark obviously is genuinely three-dimensional. It's not as flat as the thinner layers of paint. So if I was to shine light on the painting from top left, you might imagine those little dark marks would represent the cast shadows which would occur in reality. Now, I'm not sure as I said, I'm not sure I'm overly happy with the colour, that particular colour next to that white. But nevertheless, I like it as a technique, and I thought I'd mention it, just because, hopefully it might be helpful for some of you in the future. Now, onto the leg. I'm getting a little bit behind here. Can't keep up with my painting. But onto the leg, I just put in on that orange sheet. You see I had the shadow colour at the top, and then just a couple of lines to outline the lower leg. And I've deliberately, at the moment at least, left the background showing through, because that's light enough to depict the leg. And again, we're not doing super realistic, depiction here. So the texture of the leg can match the background if I decide that's the way I want to go. So similar approach for the purple sheep. We're doing shadow under the ear, dark patch of colour around the eye, little flick for the nostril, a little bit of shadow under the chin. Now this sheep, which is the one on the right in the reference, has got quite a dark belly. So still fairly wet paint that I'm painting on top of here. So it's a nice way to be really fluid and expressive. Now just putting in, they are actually the rear legs I'm putting in there of the middle sheep. And I'm not being overly fussy about making sure I've got the right number of legs here, but I just want to make sure, how can I put it, that there are enough legs around that it looks fairly convincing that they could belong to 3 sheep. So I'm hoping that not too many people are going to be going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, looking for 12 legs. But the illusion is that these animals are supported above the ground by some legs. That's the hope. Because if you think about it, or that perhaps sounded like quite a weird thing to say, I don't know about you, but if I'm looking at a flock of sheep, I kind of just see them as like, it's quite a confusion really. And my brain tends to pick out particular characters within the flock or an animal that's doing something unusual compared to the others. Very difficult when they're all bunched together to track which leg belongs to which animal. So I'm just switched up the colour a little bit here because I was thinking, this grey is kind of a little bit sombre perhaps, and I wanted to keep things a little brighter and lighter. So just mix some of the blue, ultramarine blue, into the shadow colour, just to change things up a little bit. And I don't know how well you'll be able to see in the reference. Oh, a bit of a jump there. That was unintentional. I obviously edited out unintentionally a bit of a couple of brush strokes, but I did just add a little bit of green to that shadow colour on the right towards the rear legs of the purple sheep. And that was to indicate that some of the green of the grass that I'm putting in now is reflected up onto the belly of the sheep. And that's actually the case in the reference. If you go back to the beginning of the video and look closely on that right-hand sheep, there is a little hint of a subdued green there. Now I've deliberately varied the green I've put down as I've worked my way from right to left, and I'm coming in now with a shadow colour just kind of mixed in an ultramarine blue, just to loosely depict the fact that these sheep are casting a shadow on the ground. So again, just to recap the overall approach, the beginning is very loose and surreal and very bright colours and wild random textures and so on and so on. I'm regretting having just coloured in the lower leg of that middle sheep. I wish I'd left it as it was with the background showing, but never mind. So you've got these wild textures and colours going on, and then having done that, I'm just trying to put in little pops of structure and carefully considered marks to create a little bit of reality within the wildness. And then the aim is to create sort of a unique world and, visual approach to what is a fairly familiar subject. And what I find by doing all of these different experiments is that, I won't follow, this particular pattern or path all the time, but I find it really frees me up in terms of discovering new techniques and working on new ideas. So I'll kind of pull little bits from this experiment, perhaps in the future, for a more realistic painting. We'll see how it goes. So let me show you now some of the other paintings I've done in this style: dramatically coloured skies with farm animals on a low horizon. And then I'll show you some close-ups of this finished painting, and then, have a think about which one is your favourite. Thanks very much for watching this video. Hope you enjoyed it, and hope to see you next time.